The generals who once commanded thousands now stood trembling in the cold prison camp, certain they would be executed for war crimes. They prepared themselves for the final trial for the noose or the firing squad wall, but what they never expected, the Americans didn't come to execute. They came with doctors, medicine, bandages, and a message that left the entire camp in absolute silence. We're going to treat you, not because you deserve it, but because we choose differently. That moment changed every boundary between enemy and human being. The spring of 1945 brought Berlin to its knees. The Reich that promised 1,000 years crumbled in 12. Through streets choked with rubble and ash, American forces moved methodically, securing territory, processing prisoners, separating wheat from chaff. Among the captured were not just soldiers but architects of war itself. General Frederick Wolff, who commanded 3 divisions through France, General Ernst Hartmann, whose tactical brilliance at Kursk became legend even among his enemies, General Klaus Reiner, the logistician who kept supply lines flowing when everyone said it was impossible. These men wore their uniforms still, though stripped of insignia. Their boots, once polished to mirrors, now scuffed and worn. Their faces, once stern with authority, now hollow with exhaustion, and something else, the terrible understanding that comes when power evaporates like morning fog. The Americans transported them to a detention facility outside Nuremberg, not the main prison where the highest-ranking Nazi officials awaited trial, but a smaller compound surrounded by wire and watchtowers. The building itself had been a military academy once. Now its classrooms held cots, its parade ground, guard stations. On the truck ride, Wolff sat across from Hartmann. Neither spoke for the first hour. Finally, Wolff broke the silence. 3 days, he said quietly. Maybe a week if they want to make a show of it. Hartmann understood immediately. He was estimating how long before their executions. The Americans are efficient, Hartmann replied. I'd say 5 days maximum. Reiner, slumped in the corner, didn't look up. Does it matter? We're dead men. Have been since Berlin fell. The truck hit a pothole. They swayed together, 3 men who once decided the fates of thousands, now unable to control even their own direction of travel. When they arrived at the compound, processing took 4 hours. Photographs, fingerprints, medical questionnaires they filled out mechanically, seeing no point. Why document the health of men about to be executed? Their cell block held 23 other high-ranking officers. All knew what awaited. Some maintained rigid military bearing, as if standing at attention could shield them from what was coming. Others had already collapsed inward, staring at walls or ceiling, present in body only. That first night, Wolff lay on his cot and counted the rivets in the ceiling panel above him. 47. He wondered if he would see another sunset, wondered if his wife had received his last letter, wondered if his sons would remember him as a soldier or a monster. 3 cots away, Hartmann wasn't sleeping either. His mind kept returning to a moment outside Stalingrad, a Soviet prisoner, barely 18, begging for water. Hartmann had walked past. Protocol forbade fraternization. That boy's face haunted him now in the darkness. We'll die this week, someone whispered in the dark. Nobody disagreed. The second day established their routine. Wake at dawn, cold water for washing, bread and thin coffee for breakfast. Then, nothing. Sitting, waiting. The terrible suspension of men who expect annihilation but don't know when. Wolff noticed it first in Lieutenant Colonel Brenner, a decorated tank commander now 2 cells down. Brenner's hands trembled constantly. Not from age, he was only 39, but from something deeper. At night, he talked in his sleep. Names, coordinates, the wet sound of pleading. Normandy, Hartmann said, watching Brenner during morning inspection. He was there on the first day. His entire battalion. He didn't finish. Everyone knew what happened to German formations that first day. The guards were correct but cold. They brought food on schedule, enforced rules without cruelty but without kindness either. Professional, distant, like zookeepers managing dangerous animals. Some prisoners tried to maintain military discipline among themselves. General Wolff still expected salutes from junior officers, still snapped out orders about keeping quarters tidy, as if hierarchy could protect them from what was coming. Others abandoned pretense entirely. Major General Vogel spent entire days sitting motionless, staring at his hands. Once, Reiner tried speaking to him. Vogel didn't respond, didn't even seem to register another person's presence. He'd retreated somewhere words couldn't reach. The dreams were worst. Every man experienced them, though few spoke about it. Dreams of bombs falling in reverse, of cities unburning, of dead soldiers standing up and walking backward away from battlefields. Dreams where they could undo what had been done. Hartmann dreamed repeatedly of a specific intersection in Ukraine. In the dream, he stood at that crossroads again, received the same orders, but this time said no. Refused. In the dream, everything changed because of that one word. Then he'd wake to gray light and wire fences and remember that history doesn't rewind. By day 4, several prisoners showed signs of serious illness. The brutal final months of war had left many malnourished, infected, broken. General Wolff developed a cough that rattled his entire frame. Brenner's old shrapnel wound, supposedly healed, wept infection again. Colonel Messner ran a fever that left him delirious, speaking to people who weren't there. When guards came to take Messner to the infirmary, he fought them, screaming that he wouldn't go, that he knew what the infirmary really meant. It took 3 men to restrain him. His screams echoed through the block long after they'd carried him away. "They're starting," someone whispered. "The executions." But Messner came back the next day, weak but alive, confused but treated. The fever had broken. That made the waiting worse somehow. The uncertainty. If they were going to kill us, wouldn't they just do it? Why the delay? Why treat sick prisoners you're planning to execute, unless the treatment was part of it? Keep them healthy enough to stand trial, to understand their sentences, to walk to the gallows under their own power. Wolff stopped counting rivets, started counting hours instead. 72 since arrival, 96, 120. Each passing hour both relief and torture. Still alive meant not dead yet, but not dead yet meant still waiting. Day 7 began like the others. Dawn, cold water, bread, waiting. Then at 0900 hours, unusual activity outside, trucks arriving, voices speaking rapid English, the clang of equipment being unloaded. "Here it comes," Reiner said flatly, "the tribunal." But through the wire, Hartmann saw something that didn't fit. Not soldiers with rifles, medical personnel, Red Cross symbols, equipment that looked like hospital supplies. At 0930, the cell block door opened. An American officer entered, captain's bars on his collar, medical insignia on his arm. 2 medics flanked him, carrying supply crates. Behind them, 3 more personnel with stretchers. The officer stopped in the center of the block, looked at the prisoners with an expression that wasn't hatred or disgust. "Professional assessment. Clinical. My name is Captain Michael Turner," he said in accented but clear German. "I'm the medical officer for this detention facility. Effective immediately, all prisoners will receive complete medical examinations and treatment as necessary." Silence. Then nervous laughter from someone in the back. It had to be a joke. A trick. "This isn't optional," Turner continued. "Geneva Convention requires proper medical care for all prisoners of war, regardless of rank or allegations of war crimes. We start examinations today. Anyone currently ill or injured, step forward." Nobody moved. The prisoners looked at each other, confused, suspicious. Turner sighed. Consulted a clipboard. "General Frederick Wolff. Step forward, please." Wolff remained frozen on his cot. A trap. Had to be. "General Wolff," Turner repeated. "Your intake form indicates chronic respiratory issues and recent weight loss. I need to examine you." "Why?" The word came out harsh, challenging. "Because that's my job. We're war criminals." "Why treat us?" Turner met his eyes. "That's not for me to determine. I'm a physician. You're a patient who needs care. That's the beginning and end of it. He gestured to the medics, who began setting up a portable examination area. Within minutes, they'd created something resembling a makeshift clinic right there in the cell block. Privacy screens, a table, medical instruments laid out with careful precision. "Who's first?" Turner asked. Still nobody moved. The psychological dissonance was too great. You don't go peacefully to your own execution. You don't trust your executioner's gentleness. Turner tried a different approach. "Gentlemen, I understand your confusion, but I assure you, this is standard procedure. We're not here to harm you. We're here because international law and basic human decency require proper medical care for prisoners, even prisoners who committed atrocities." The challenge came from Brenner, his voice sharp with something between hope and accusation. "Even then," Turner said simply, "we follow the law, even when others didn't." That sentence landed differently. It carried weight. Not judgment exactly, but acknowledgement. "We know what you did. We're choosing to be different anyway." Slowly, Colonel Messner stood, still weak from his fever but steady enough to walk. "I'll go first." Turner nodded. "Thank you, Colonel. Please, behind the screen." For 30 minutes, the block listened to the sounds of a medical examination. Turner's questions, calm and methodical. Messner's responses, hesitant at first, then more forthcoming. The clinical sounds of stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, percussion hammer. When Messner emerged, he looked dazed. He actually examined me, prescribed medication, said I need better nutrition and rest. Did he say anything about? Vogel couldn't finish the question. About a trial? Execution? No. Just medicine. Just healing. One by one through that morning and afternoon, the prisoners went behind the screen. Some still skeptical, some too ill to care, but all examined, all treated with the same careful professionalism. When it was Hartman's turn, he found himself explaining old injuries, chronic pain, symptoms he'd ignored for months. Turner listened, took notes, gave prescriptions. "You have an ulcer," Turner said finally. "Stress-induced, probably. We'll start you on medication and a specific diet. Should see improvement within 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Hartman couldn't hide his surprise. "You think I have 2 weeks?" Turner looked at him directly. "General Hartman, I don't know what your legal situation will be. That's not my department. But medically speaking, yes, you need at least 2 weeks of treatment before we'll see significant improvement." It was so matter-of-fact, so presumptuous of a future that might not exist. The cognitive dissonance made Hartman's head spin. General Wolff's examination took longest. When Turner pulled back the blanket covering Wolff's legs, the smell hit immediately. Infection. Bad. "How long has your leg been like this?" Turner's voice remained professionally neutral, but his jaw tightened. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. Wolff's voice was hollow. Didn't seem worth mentioning. The wound ran from ankle to mid-calf. What started as a minor cut had become infected during the chaotic final weeks of war. No time for treatment. No supplies even if there had been time. Now the tissue around it was inflamed, angry red streaking up toward his knee. Early signs of gangrene. "You could lose this leg," Turner said bluntly. "Possibly your life. This needs immediate aggressive treatment. Then don't treat it." Turner looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" I said don't treat it. Wolff's voice carried grim certainty. "I'm a dead man anyway. Court-martial. Hanging. Why delay the inevitable? Let the infection take me. It's cleaner than a rope." Turner set down his instruments, sat back, looked at Wolff not as doctor to patient but as one human to another. "General, I'm not going to argue with you about your fate. That's outside my purview. But I am going to tell you this. I took an oath to heal when possible, to reduce suffering when I can. Your suffering is possible to reduce. Therefore, I'm going to treat you. Whether you want me to or not. I could refuse treatment. You could try. But this facility operates under international law, Geneva Convention, which means medical care isn't optional. It's mandatory. Wolff laughed bitterly. We didn't follow Geneva Convention with Soviet prisoners. I know. Turner's voice didn't change inflection. Which is why it matters that we do. He called for his senior medic. Together they began cleaning the wound. Wolff gasped at the pain despite himself. Turner worked methodically, debriding dead tissue, irrigating with antiseptic, applying sulfa powder. The newest penicillin came next, injected directly. This is going to hurt for a few days, Turner explained as he wrapped the leg in clean bandages. We'll change these twice daily. You'll need to keep weight off it. I'm prescribing antibiotics and pain medication. Why? The question burst out of Wolff. Why do this? I gave orders that sent American soldiers to their deaths, boys from your country. Why save my leg? Why save me? Turner finished securing the bandage before answering. When he looked up, his eyes were tired but clear. Because I'm a doctor, General, not a judge, not a politician, not a soldier anymore, really. Just a physician who treats patients. He paused. Besides, letting you die of infection would be the easy way out. If you've done what they say you've done, you need to face that. Running away through death. That's cowardice. He stood, gathered his supplies. I'll be back tomorrow to check the wound. Try to rest. As Turner moved to leave, Wolff spoke again, quietly this time. I killed your people. Gave the orders myself. Boys who never made it home. Turner stopped, his shoulders tensed. For a moment he didn't turn around. I know, he said finally. My younger brother was one of them. Omaha Beach. June 6th, 1944. The silence that followed was absolute. Wolff felt something break inside his chest. Turner turned then, and Wolff saw it in his eyes, grief, old and deep and never quite healed. But no hatred, just profound sadness and something else. Determination. I don't treat you because you deserve it, General. I treat you because I refuse to become what you were. Because the moment I let hatred dictate my actions, I've lost the very thing that makes this worth fighting for. He left. Wolff sat there, leg throbbing with pain and proper treatment both. For the first time since capture, he wept. Not from fear or despair, from shame, from the terrible gift of undeserved mercy. Over the next week, a transformation began. Subtle at first, then undeniable. The prisoners started observing not just their own treatment, but how the Americans operated the entire facility. Hartman noticed it first. The way guards spoke to each other. No screaming, no arbitrary cruelty. Just professional distance and respect for procedure. Even when breaking up fights between prisoners, they used minimum necessary force, nothing more. One afternoon, Hartman watched through the window as an American private dropped a box of supplies. Canned goods scattered across the yard. The private cursed, started picking them up. An officer approached Hartman, expected harsh words, maybe punishment. Instead, the officer helped gather the cans, said something that made the private laugh. Then they both carried the supplies inside. Such a small thing, almost meaningless. Except Hartman couldn't imagine that scene with German officers. The private would have been punished, made an example, humiliated before peers. They treat each other like people, he said to Reiner one evening. They always have, Reiner replied. That's what we never understood. We thought it was weakness. At night, they heard guards talking. English was difficult for most prisoners, but some phrases carried universal meaning. Laughter. Someone's birthday. Worries about a letter from home. The ordinary humanity of young men far from home, doing a job, wanting the war truly over. Wolff recovered slowly. The infection fought back before antibiotics won. Turner visited twice daily, monitoring progress with the same careful attention he'd given that first examination. Never friendly exactly, but never cruel. Professional. Consistent. Your brother, Wolff said during one bandage change. What was his name? Turner's hands paused briefly. Daniel. Danny. He was 19. I'm sorry. Are you? Turner's voice wasn't challenging, just genuinely curious. Wolff thought about it. Really thought. Yes, I am. Not because of what might happen to me, but because he should be alive, should be home, should have a future. And orders I gave contributed to him not having that. Turner finished the bandage. That's the first time you've said something that sounds like actual remorse rather than self-pity. I thought they were the same thing. Most people do. Turner packed his supplies. Real remorse looks outward. Self-pity looks inward. You're starting to look outward. After he left, Wolff sat with that distinction. It mattered somehow. Shifted something internal he hadn't even known was misaligned. 3 cells down, a different conversation unfolded. Brenner had been refusing food for days, convinced it was poisoned or drugged. A young American medic named Sarah Chen sat patiently outside his cell. "Lieutenant Colonel Brenner, you need to eat," she said in careful German. "Why should I trust you? You probably shouldn't. We're enemies. Or were. But here's the thing, you can watch me eat from the same pot we're serving you from. Right now. Will that help?" She proceeded to do exactly that. Spooned soup from the prisoner's pot into her own bowl. Ate it while Brenner watched suspiciously. "See? Not poisoned. Just soup. Not even good soup, honestly. Military kitchens are terrible regardless of which army." Despite himself, Brenner felt his lips twitch towards something like a smile. "My brother died in Normandy," Chen said, still eating. "Tank commander, 23 years old. Got hit by a Panzerfaust. Your weapon, maybe even your unit, I don't know." Brenner's almost smile vanished. "Then why help me?" Chen set down her bowl. Met his eyes. "Because I'm not treating the German officer who maybe killed my brother. I'm treating a human being who's starving himself. Those are different things." She stood to leave. "The soup's there if you want it." Your choice. That night, Brenner ate. Not because he trusted them, but because her simple honesty had created a crack in his defensive certainty. These small moments accumulated. A guard helping an elderly colonel upstairs. A medic spending extra time explaining medication in broken German. Turner bringing Wolff a book after hearing him mention missing reading. They follow rules, Vogel observed during evening roll call. Not because someone's watching, but because that's just what they do. It's discipline, Hartman said. Different from ours, but still discipline. No. Reiner shook his head slowly. It's not discipline, it's culture. They actually believe in treating people with dignity. We believed in obedience. Those aren't the same thing at all. The realization settled over them like cold water. Everything they'd been taught about strength and weakness, about power and mercy, about victory and defeat, all of it suddenly seemed built on faulty assumptions. One evening, Hartman found himself thinking about Soviet prisoners, the ones he'd walked past, the ones denied water, medical care, basic humanity. He'd told himself it was necessary, strategic. That emotion had no place in war, but watching the Americans operate with both efficiency and compassion, he saw what he'd refused to see before. Cruelty hadn't made German soldiers stronger. It had made them smaller, more fearful, more dependent on brutality because they'd never learned to lead through anything else. "We were wrong," he said quietly to Wolff after lights out. About everything that mattered. In the darkness, Wolff's response was barely audible. "I know." The breakthrough came during Hartman's physical therapy session. Turner had assigned him exercises to strengthen his injured shoulder, old shrapnel wound that had healed poorly. The therapy hurt. Hartman, not one to complain, gritted his teeth through it. Sarah Chen supervised the session. Halfway through, she noticed him struggling. "You can take a break, General. This isn't a test of endurance. I'm fine. You're clearly not." She moved closer. "Look, pain is useful information. It tells us when to stop before we cause more damage. Pushing through it isn't brave. It's counterproductive." Hartman lowered his arm, studied her face. "You lost your brother." "Yes. Tank commander. Maybe killed by my units." "Probably." Her voice stayed level. "2nd Armored Division. Normandy breakout. Your forces were active in that sector. Then why? Why treat me with anything except hatred? Chen sat down across from him, considered her words carefully. You want the honest answer? Not the professional one? Please. I hate what you did. What your army did. The ideology you fought for. I hate that my brother died stopping it. She paused. But I don't know you, General Hartman. I don't know your specific orders, your specific actions, and more importantly, hating you doesn't bring James back, doesn't undo any of it, doesn't make the world better. She gestured around the facility. So, I have a choice. I can let my hatred poison me, make me cruel, make me into something James wouldn't recognize. Or I can do the work I was trained to do, heal when possible, reduce suffering, choose to be different than what I'm fighting against. That's remarkably idealistic for someone who's lost so much. Maybe, or maybe it's the only way to make sure his death meant something. He died fighting fascism, fighting a system that treated people as less than human. If I become cruel, if I dehumanize prisoners, then what did he die for? To replace one kind of brutality with another? The therapy room fell quiet except for distant sounds of the compound. I'm trying to understand, Hartman said finally, where you find that strength, that forgiveness. I haven't forgiven anything. Chen's voice hardened slightly. Don't confuse medical care with forgiveness. I'm not absolving you. I'm choosing not to let what you did determine who I become. She stood. Now, let's finish this therapy session, and this time, when something hurts, you tell me. Deal? Deal. That conversation rippled through the prisoner population. Hartman shared it with others. The distinction Chen made between professional duty and personal feeling, between treating someone and forgiving them, resonated. Turner himself sat down with Wolff 3 days later for a longer conversation. The infection had cleared. The leg was healing. Turner was pleased with the progress. You'll walk without a limp, he said, examining the healing tissue. Full recovery in another month. And then you stand trial. Or don't. That's not my decision. Wolff nodded. Then, carefully, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. When you treat me, when you save my leg, prescribe medication, check on me daily, what do you think about? Turner continued his examination. Didn't answer immediately. Honestly, I think about doing my job correctly, following proper procedure, making sure the wound heals cleanly. That's all? Mostly. Turner set down his instruments. Sometimes I think about Danny. Sometimes I imagine him captured instead of killed. Imagine him in a prison camp. I wonder, would his captors have treated him the way I'm treating you? Would they have cared about his infected leg? Wolff looked away. They both knew the answer. And that thought, Turner continued, reminds me why this matters, why we followed Geneva Convention even when others didn't. Because the moment we abandon our principles in response to others abandoning theirs, we've lost the moral high ground that justifies everything else. That's a heavy burden. It is. But someone has to carry it. Turner started repacking his medical bag. Besides, if I let hatred guide my actions, then Hitler wins. Even in defeat, he wins. Because he's turned me into something closer to what he wanted all of us to be, governed by tribal hatred instead of universal principles. You really believe that? That principles matter more than revenge? I believe that principles are the only thing that will stop the next war. Revenge just sets up the next cycle. Hell, revenge for World War I is partly why we're here now. Wolff absorbed that. You're wiser than your years, Captain. I'm tired beyond my years, Turner corrected. There's a difference. Another conversation, this time between multiple prisoners and guards. Late afternoon, during supervised outdoor exercise, a philosophical discussion emerged almost accidentally about the nature of duty. We were following orders, Colonel Messner argued to Sergeant Frank Morrison, who was supervising. What else could we do? Morrison, who'd fought from North Africa through Italy to Germany, didn't rise to the bait. You could have refused, he said simply, and been executed for insubordination. Maybe. Or maybe if enough of you had refused, things would have changed. But choosing execution over committing atrocities, that's what courage actually looks like. Easy to say when you weren't there. I was there. Morrison's voice hardened. I was at camps we liberated. Saw what following orders led to. Don't tell me about difficult choices when you chose convenience over conscience. The words stung because they carried truth. Messner had no response, but Brenner, listening nearby, spoke up. You're right. We told ourselves we had no choice because it was easier than admitting we did have choices, just hard ones. Morrison looked at him, nodded slowly. That's the first honest thing I've heard from any of you. These dialogues, painful, honest, stripping away justifications, happened with increasing frequency. The American personnel didn't lecture or condemn. They simply refused to accept convenient lies, refused to let the prisoners hide behind following orders or doing our duty. And something shifted. The prisoners started speaking differently to each other, started acknowledging uncomfortable truths they'd avoided. One evening, 5 generals sat together during mealtime. Unusual for such senior officers to cluster, but the normal hierarchies had dissolved. I knew, General Wolff said quietly. About the camps, maybe not every detail, but enough. And I didn't speak up because it was inconvenient, because it might have cost me my career. The others sat silent. I walked past prisoners begging for water, Hartman added. Told myself it was protocol. But really, I just didn't want to see them as human. Easier not to. One by one, they spoke. Small confessions, acknowledgments, nothing grand or dramatic. Just the slow, painful work of facing what they'd allowed themselves to become. Above them, the guard tower light swept the compound. Inside, Americans and Germans existed in a strange new space. Not quite friendship, not quite forgiveness, but something more honest than either. The beginning of accountability. But not everyone moved toward acceptance. For some prisoners, American kindness felt like the worst insult possible. Colonel Werner Steiner had been a decorated officer, feared by subordinates and respected by superiors. He'd built his entire identity on strength, dominance, superiority. Now, being treated with gentle professionalism by the enemy he'd been taught to despise, it broke something inside him. This is humiliation, he spat during morning inspection. Worse than execution. They're emasculating us with kindness. They're following international law, Hartman replied carefully. Law? Steiner's laugh was harsh. They beat us through industrial might. Now they're trying to break us psychologically, making us grateful for their mercy. It's sophisticated torture. Or maybe they're just decent people. There's no such thing in war. Steiner's voice rose. There's winners and losers, victors and defeated. This middle ground, this pretense of humanitarianism, it's a lie designed to make us accept subjugation. He wasn't alone in this rage. A cluster of 6 officers held similar views. They refused medical treatment when possible, turned away from friendly overtures, interpreted every kindness as manipulation. I demand to be executed, Steiner told Turner during a mandatory medical check. Immediately. Court-martial me, judge me, hang me. But stop this patronizing charity. Turner, checking Steiner's blood pressure, didn't react emotionally. That's not how this works, Colonel. I'm a prisoner of war who committed acts you consider criminal. Execute me like you would any enemy. We're not executing anyone without proper legal proceedings. And those proceedings will happen according to law, not your preferred timeline. You're weak, the accusation burst out. You beat us in battle, but you're too weak to finish it, too soft to do what victors should do. Turner finished his examination, marked notes on his chart. When he spoke, his voice was measured but firm. Colonel Steiner, you're confusing weakness with restraint. They're not the same thing. We have the power to treat you however we want. We're choosing to follow law and convention. That's not weakness. That's civilization. It's cowardice. Believe what you need to. But you're still getting medical care whether you like it or not. Steiner's fury only intensified. He organized a protest among like-minded prisoners. They refused food for 2 days, demanded immediate trials or immediate execution, anything, to end the unbearable tension of being treated well by enemies. The American command responded with patience and firmness. No punishment for the hunger strike, that was their right. But medical monitoring continued, and when prisoners started showing signs of dangerous malnourishment, they were force-fed through medical procedure, not as punishment but as health intervention. "You're proving my point," Steiner shouted as medics prepared the feeding tube. "You can't even let us die with dignity." "Dignity isn't suicide, Colonel," Chen said, prepping the equipment. "And we're not letting anyone die on our watch when we can prevent it." The feeding tube went in. Steiner gagged, struggled, but ultimately couldn't prevent the sustenance. After several days of this, the hunger strike collapsed. They'd tried to refuse mercy and found it wasn't optional. This failure broke something in Steiner. His rage turned inward. Depression settled over him like fog. For 3 days he didn't speak, didn't eat beyond what was required, sat motionless, staring at walls. Hartman, watching this deterioration, felt compelled to intervene. During evening recreation period, he sat beside Steiner. "You're destroying yourself," Hartman said quietly. "Good. Why?" "Because I can't destroy them." Steiner's voice was flat, empty. "Can't make them cruel. Can't force them to become what I expected. So all that's left is destroying myself. That's not honor. That's just sad." Steiner finally turned to look at him. His eyes were hollow. "What do you want from me? Gratitude? Should I thank them for saving my life so I can be hanged later? I want you to see what I'm seeing. That maybe everything we were taught about strength and weakness was backward. You've gone soft. Maybe. Or maybe I've finally woken up." Hartman leaned forward. "They broke us, Werner. Not through torture. Not through cruelty. Through being better than we ever were. That's what you can't stand. Not their kindness, their superiority." The word hit like a slap. Superior. The one thing German ideology could never admit about anyone else. "They're not superior," Steiner whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "They beat us militarily. They're treating us better than we treated prisoners. They're following principles even when it's hard. In what way aren't they demonstrating superiority?" Steiner had no answer. The silence stretched. Hartman stood. "Your choice is simple. You can destroy yourself fighting against reality, or you can accept it and figure out what comes next. But either way, they're going to keep treating you like a human being. That's the one thing you can't escape." He walked away, leaving Steiner alone with thoughts he'd spent weeks trying to suppress. Over the following days, Steiner slowly emerged from his depression. Not into acceptance exactly, but into something more complex, a kind of exhausted recognition. The Americans wouldn't give him the clean ending of execution or the satisfying conflict of cruelty. They would simply, persistently, treat him with the dignity he'd denied others. And that realization that he was trapped in mercy became its own form of accountability. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Mail call was weekly, supervised and screened. Most prisoners never received anything, families dead, displaced, or too ashamed to write. But this week, a thin envelope reached General Klaus Reiner. He stared at it for long minutes before opening. Recognized his wife's handwriting. Hadn't heard from her since Berlin fell. Assumed the worst. Inside, 3 pages. Her neat script. Words that made him read twice to believe. "My dearest Klaus, we are alive. Maria, little Stefan, mother, all alive. I write from cousin Herman's farm outside Munich. We walked here 3 weeks on foot with what we could carry. But we made it. Klaus, I must tell you something that will seem impossible. The Americans came through last week. We feared the worst, heard stories of armies and what they do to conquered populations. Maria and I hid Stefan in the cellar. But Klaus, they brought food, medical supplies. They set up a field hospital in the town square and treated anyone who needed help. Free. No questions about politics or allegiance, just medical care. Stefan had developed terrible cough, you know how his lungs are weak. I thought we would lose him. But an American doctor, young man from somewhere called Ohio, He examined Stefan, gave him medicine, penicillin they called it. Within days, the cough broke. Our son is recovering because of enemy doctors. I don't understand this war anymore. I don't understand how people we were taught to hate are the ones saving our child's life, feeding us when we're hungry, helping rebuild what was destroyed. I think of you in prison, and I pray they treat you with the same unexpected kindness they showed us. I pray this madness ends, and you come home to us. We love you. We wait for you. Stay strong, my heart. Your Anna. Reiner's hands trembled. He read it again, then a third time. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Enemy soldiers feeding his family, saving his son, offering help to the very people they'd defeated. He thought of Soviet prisoners he'd overseen, the rations withheld, the medical care denied, the deliberate cruelty he'd justified as military necessity, his family given mercy they'd never shown others. That evening, Reiner requested a meeting with Captain Turner. They sat across from each other in a small interview room. Turner waited patiently while Reiner gathered courage to speak. I received a letter from my wife, Reiner began. His voice cracked. She wrote about American doctors saving my son's life, feeding my family, treating them with kindness I never showed to prisoners under my authority. Turner listened without interrupting. I want to apologize. The words came hard, not because I think it will help my situation, not to earn leniency, but because I need to say it to someone who understands what it means. I'm listening. I was logistics officer for 3 POW camps, Soviet prisoners primarily. I knew they were starving, knew they were dying from preventable diseases, had the authority to allocate better resources. Didn't. Reiner's hands twisted together. Told myself it was orders, that I was just following protocol. But that was a lie. I could have done more. Chose not to because it was easier. Because they weren't. He stopped. Because they weren't human to you, Turner finished. Yes. The word was barely audible. And now, enemy soldiers are treating my family better than I treated theirs. The injustice of that, the shame, I can barely breathe under it. Turner sat back, considered his response carefully. General Reiner, I'm not a chaplain. I can't give you absolution. I'm not a judge, can't determine your guilt or punishment. But I can tell you this, what you're feeling right now, that crushing weight that's called conscience. Some people never find it. You have. What you do with it next is what matters. What can I do? From a prison cell? Tell the truth. When you're interrogated, when you testify, tell the truth. Not a sanitized version, not a legally strategic version, the actual truth about what happened, what you did, what you knew. Let the world understand the full reality of what those camps were like. Reiner nodded slowly. And that's supposed to balance the scales? Nothing balances these scales, General. That's the terrible truth. But accountability is at least a step towards something resembling justice. After Reiner left, Turner sat alone in the interview room. These conversations exhausted him, each prisoner's slow awakening to what they'd done, what they'd been part of. He witnessed these transformations and felt the weight of them. He thought about his brother Danny, wondered if Danny would approve of this work, healing the men who contributed to his death. Turner liked to think yes, Danny had always been the idealistic one, the one who believed people could change, could be better than their worst moments. I hope I'm doing this right, Turner said quietly to the empty room. I hope this matters. But Reiner's transformation rippled outward. He shared his wife's letter with other prisoners. The cognitive dissonance spread this jarring evidence that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was showing more humanity than they'd shown others. One by one, other prisoners started requesting meetings, started speaking honestly about their actions, their choices, their shame. Not all of them. Some remained hardened, but enough shifted that the atmosphere in the compound changed. Accountability, Turner realized, wasn't something you could force. It had to emerge from within, from the unbearable tension between what you'd done and what you knew was right. The Americans' kindness didn't create that tension, it just made it impossible to ignore. The formal legal process began on a cold morning in October. Not mass trials, but individual interrogations, building cases, determining levels of responsibility. General Wolff was called first. 2 guards escorted him to a building he'd never entered before. Expected a stark interrogation room. Instead found something more like a legal office. 3 American officers behind a table. A stenographer. His defense counsel appointed by the military. German-speaking. No restraints. No intimidation tactics. Just methodical questioning. General Wolff, please state your full name and rank for the record. He did. And then, for 6 hours, they walked through his service history. Where he'd commanded. What orders he'd given. What he'd known about concentration camps, partisan reprisals, treatment of POWs. The remarkable thing, they already knew most of it. Had documents, testimonies from subordinates, communications, logs. They weren't fishing for information. They were confirming facts and gauging his willingness to cooperate. General, do you deny ordering reprisal executions in 3 villages near Minsk in December 1943? Wolff could have denied it, could have claimed he was just following orders from above, could have done what he'd planned to do, protect himself through legal maneuvering. Instead, he thought of Turner, of Chen, of the unbearable kindness that had stripped away his protective rationalizations. No, he said, I don't deny it. I gave those orders directly. The interrogators paused. They'd expected resistance. Can you explain the context? Partisans had ambushed a supply convoy, killed 15 of my men. I was told to make an example, ensure it wouldn't happen again. And did you question these orders? No. Why not? This was the moment. The place where he could retreat into comfortable excuses. Instead, Wolff forced himself toward truth. Because I agreed with them. Thought collective punishment was justified. Thought it was military necessity. He paused. I was wrong. The lead interrogator, Colonel Richard Brennan, leaned forward. You were wrong? Yes. They were civilians, farmers. Most had nothing to do with the partisans, but they were convenient. And I was angry, so I ordered the executions and told myself it was strategy when really it was revenge. The stenographer's fingers paused over the keys. This kind of unambiguous admission was rare. General Wolff, you understand this testimony will be used in determining your prosecution? I understand. Why tell the truth when you could claim ignorance or coercion? Wolff looked at his hands, remembered Reiner's letter, thought about enemy doctors saving children while he'd ordered children shot. Because I'm tired of lies, including the ones I told myself. If there's any chance of this nightmare meaning something, it starts with truth. The interrogation continued, but the tone had shifted. This wasn't adversarial anymore. It was almost collaborative, establishing historical record. Wolff answered every question directly, admitted what he knew, acknowledged what he'd done. When it ended 7 hours later, he was exhausted, but also lighter somehow, as if confession itself had been a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. Other generals followed similar patterns. Not all. Some maintained innocence, blamed superiors, argued about orders, but enough chose honesty that the prosecution teams had something unprecedented detailed. First-person accounts from senior officers about how the system worked, how orders filtered down, how atrocities became normalized. Hartmann's interrogation proved particularly valuable. His memory for detail, his understanding of command structure, his willingness to explain not just what happened but why it gave prosecutors crucial context. You're helping convict yourself, his defense counsel pointed out during a break. I know. Then why? Hartmann thought of Chen, of her brother James who died stopping what Hartmann fought for. Because hiding the truth means those deaths meant nothing. If we don't face what we did, if we don't let the world understand exactly how this happened, then we're guaranteeing it happens again. The legal proceedings weren't vengeful, they were thorough. And in that methodical accumulation of evidence and testimony, something profound was happening. The prisoners were participating in their own accountability. Not because they were forced to, though the trials would happen regardless, but because the Americans' humanity had created space for conscience to emerge. In November, Colonel Brennan called Turner to his office. "Captain, I wanted you to know the medical care you've provided has significantly impacted these proceedings." "How so?" 15 of the senior officers have given full, detailed confessions. Testimony that's invaluable for understanding command structure and decision-making. They're cooperating to a degree we never anticipated. I just treated their medical conditions. You did more than that." Brennan pulled out a folder. "I've read their statements. Multiple prisoners specifically cite the contrast between their treatment here and how they treated others. Your work, the work of your medical team, it's created cognitive dissonance they can't ignore." Turner absorbed this. "You're saying, our kindness is useful. I'm saying your professionalism, your adherence to Geneva Convention even when they didn't, your basic human decency, it's dismantled their psychological defenses more effectively than any interrogation technique could. That wasn't the goal. I know. Which is probably why it worked." Brennan closed the folder. "Look, some of these men will hang, some will face long imprisonment, but we're getting truth we'd never get through coercion. Historical record that will prevent future denials. That matters." After leaving Brennan's office, Turner walked through the compound. Saw prisoners in recreation yard, guards maintaining professional distance, medics making rounds. An ordinary day in an extraordinary situation. He thought about outcomes, about how treating wounded prisoners as patients rather than enemies had somehow contributed to justice, not by being soft or weak, but by being principled when principle seemed impossible. "Hey, Doc," Chen called from across the yard. "Got a minute?" "Colonel Messner's ulcer is flaring again." "Coming," Turner called back, and went to do his job. The same job he'd been doing all along. Healing when possible, reducing suffering where he could, following his oath especially when it was difficult. The trials would continue, justice would be served. But something larger was happening too. A demonstration that civilization could survive even the worst conflict, that humans could choose restraint even when revenge would be easier. That choice, Turner was beginning to understand, might be the most important victory of all. 20 years later, General Ernst Hartmann sat in a small apartment in Munich, writing. He'd served 12 years, released in 1957 for cooperation, and demonstrated remorse. Now, approaching 70, he spent his days documenting what happened in that American prison camp, what he'd learned, how it changed him. The memoir wasn't self-serving, wasn't trying to minimize his crimes. Instead, it was an unflinching examination of how ordinary men became monsters and how mercy had broken through that transformation. He wrote about Captain Turner, about Sarah Chen, about the profound dissonance of receiving better treatment from enemies than he'd given to prisoners under his command. But mostly he wrote about a specific moment, 3 weeks into his detention, when he'd finally stopped seeing the Americans as captors and started seeing them as people whose moral framework was fundamentally different from his own. They defeated us militarily through industrial might and strategic superiority. But they defeated us morally through something simpler, choosing principles over revenge. By treating us according to Geneva Convention even when we hadn't followed it ourselves, they proved the ideology we'd fought for was bankrupt. We told ourselves strength meant domination. They showed us strength meant restraint. We believed power justified cruelty. They proved power obligated mercy. We thought victory meant crushing enemies. They demonstrated victory meant building peace. I cannot undo my crimes, cannot bring back those who died because of orders I gave. But I can ensure the record shows what happened. Not to excuse, to explain. So future generations understand how good men convince themselves evil is necessary, and how only something stronger than revenge can break that cycle. The memoir was published in 1965. Became required reading in German schools. Not because it offered absolution, but because it offered warning. Reiner wrote his own account. Focused on logistics, the mundane, bureaucratic evil of systematically denying prisoners food and medicine, how easy it was to kill through neglect rather than direct action, how that somehow felt less culpable even though the dead were just as dead. His chapter on receiving his wife's letter, on learning enemy doctors saved his son while he'd let others' children starve, became one of the most quoted passages in post-war German literature. The cognitive dissonance made tangible, the shame unavoidable. Even Steiner eventually wrote. His account was angrier, more resistant, but even his testimony included grudging acknowledgement. They broke me not through cruelty but through an excess of principle. I wanted them to become what I expected, vengeful, arbitrary, brutal. Instead, they remained frustratingly, persistently professional. In the end, their refusal to descend to our level was more damning than any punishment could have been. Captain Michael Turner never wrote about his experience, continued his medical career, became a prominent surgeon in Boston, occasionally gave lectures to military medical personnel about maintaining professional ethics under difficult circumstances. In 1978, he received a letter from Klaus Reiner. Reiner was dying. Wanted to thank the American doctor who'd created space for conscience through simple professional medical care. You saved more than my leg, Captain. You saved my soul. Not through sermons or lectures, through demonstrating daily that being better than your enemies is possible. That principles matter even when inconvenient, especially when inconvenient. I will die soon knowing I committed terrible crimes, accepting responsibility for those crimes, but also believing that humans can choose differently, that we're not trapped in cycles of revenge and cruelty. Because I witnessed men like you choose restraint when revenge would have been easier. Thank you for your professionalism, your adherence to oaths and conventions, your stubborn, difficult choice to be decent when decency seemed impossible. It mattered more than you'll ever know. Turner kept that letter. When he died in 1995, his children found it among his papers, along with dozens of similar letters, from former prisoners, from their families, from German students studying the war, all saying the same thing in different words. The mercy shown by Americans in those prison camps had somehow mattered, had created space for accountability, had demonstrated that civilization could survive even the worst conflicts. Sarah Chen became a prominent psychiatrist specializing in trauma and moral injury. Her research on soldiers wrestling with wartime actions helped establish modern understanding of conscience and accountability. She spoke often about those months treating German prisoners. We didn't forgive them, she always clarified. Forgiveness wasn't ours to give. The dead can't forgive. But we chose not to let their crimes determine who we became. That choice to maintain our principles even in the face of monstrous actions, that was our victory, more lasting than any military defeat. The prison camp itself was demolished in 1952. A plaque marks the spot now. The inscription reads, "Here, from 1945 to 1947, German military prisoners received medical care under Geneva Convention. Allied personnel demonstrated that even in war's aftermath, human dignity need not be abandoned. May this place remind us that choosing mercy over revenge, principle over passion, represents humanity's highest aspiration." Students visit, historians lecture. The site has become a symbol of something difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore, that how we treat defeated enemies says more about us than about them. The final word belongs to Hartmann's memoir. His last paragraph, written just before his death in 1971. Young people ask me how to prevent future atrocities. They expect complex answers about political systems, economic conditions, ideological indoctrination. And yes, those things matter. But I tell them about an American captain who saved the leg of a man who'd contributed to killing his brother, about a medic who fed a prisoner who might have killed her brother, about guards who maintained discipline through respect rather than fear. I tell them that the antidote to atrocity isn't revenge. It's the stubborn, difficult, daily choice to treat humans as humans even when they've proven they don't deserve it. Because that choice repeated across thousands of small moments is what civilization actually means. The Americans didn't conquer us through force alone. They conquered us by being better than we were, by showing us a different way, by proving that strength and mercy aren't opposites but complements. If you remember nothing else from this account, remember this. They gave us health care when we expected death, not because we deserved it, but because they refused to become what they'd defeated. That refusal, that principled stubbornness in the face of justified hatred, that saved more than bodies. It saved the possibility that we humans might someday be better than our worst moments. I pray we prove worthy of that possibility. The memoir ends there. No neat resolution, no complete redemption. Just the complex, difficult truth that mercy extended to undeserving enemies somehow mattered, somehow created space for accountability and growth. That truth echoes still. In classrooms, in military training, in ethical discussions about justice and revenge. The German generals who expected execution but received health care instead became a kind of parable, a reminder that civilization's survival depends not on how we treat those we love, but on how we treat those we have every right to hate. And in that reminder lives something precious, the stubborn human hope that we might, someday, choose to be better than our worst impulses. Not because it's easy, but because it's possible. Because they showed us it was possible.